Hi everyone! A friend of mine sent me a link to a YouTube video that's a compilation of TikToks replying to the original TikTok right here, where the person is asking ex-Christians what their turning point was. In the responses, the turning point that some people talk about is the event that started them to criticize or be more skeptical of their beliefs, and eventually they left the religion, or it's the turning point that was the end, where they ended their religion, they left their faith. Either way, they were all pretty varied, but did have sort of a common theme, which seemed to be kind of a personal experience that was negative. Something that was condescending, or they found to be hypocritical, something bad that happened with the pastor or some people at the church, arguments between people at the church and themselves, things that had to do with marginalized communities that were not accepted by their particular sect. And for me, I hadn't really heard those as a reason. In fact, out of the history of my YouTube channel, only one person stands out as having said anything like this, and they stand out because they said something like this, that they left Christianity because the people at church were really judgmental towards them. And I remember telling them that, I'm not going to welcome you as an atheist because I really think you should actually reevaluate why you left. After all, if Christianity is true, is this the reason you want to have abandoned the truth? Because some people at church were jerks? In my case, yeah, of course you're not going to get along with everyone. Now, our church was pretty welcoming in some cases, but of course, people are people and judgmental in other cases. And, the religion does encourage judgment, doesn't it? Especially Christian on Christian judgment. And I did a video on that, which will be linked in the pinned comment below. But if somebody was cruel to me or rude to me, I just thought that person was a jerk. Not even necessarily a bad Christian, just a jerk. And that was that. Somebody being rude is no reason for me to question God. I had a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. How could anybody cause me to question my relationship with God? I ended up telling people later, after I became an atheist, that I was so Christian, the only thing that could make me leave the religion was the Bible. And by that, I mean that was really my turning point that started me on that road to eventually leaving my faith. I really, really wanted to enter the ministry field. I wanted to become a pastor and be a pastor abroad as a missionary. I thought that's what the Lord's calling was for me. So of course I started studying my Bible, and where do you start but Genesis? Which was interesting. I always remember people recommending that we start with the Gospels, like start with Matthew, and I thought, why not start at the beginning? That always seemed very weird to me. So I started at the beginning. Right away I noticed some things that didn't line up with what I was taught. Like a lot of Christians, I didn't open my Bible and study it from cover to cover. I had it either read to me and interpreted, or I just had a pastor, for example, that had a sermon that was made up of different verses throughout the Bible. They would be read, and then the pastor would talk for 10, 15, 30 minutes about something that was inspired from the text, but not from the text. They wanted to relate it to modern times, but they weren't really interested in reading the text itself. I had listened to Christian radio, and that was similar. And my mom would buy some of these books from Christian bookstores that also had a similar vein, and sometimes I read them, sometimes she spoke of them, so, I got their message that way, but never really just opening the text and reading it cover to cover. So I did. And when I did, it was, again, very shocking. It was shocking to read because some of the things that were told in church that were interpreted for us, they weren't mentioned in the text. Like the Garden of Eden, the serpent was just a serpent. It wasn't Satan, it was just a serpent. There's nothing about it. And it says not only was it a serpent, but God made serpents the craftiest of all creatures. Well, that seems weird. Why would God do that? That seemed a bit strange. Another one that seemed odd to me in Genesis was that God regretted. Now, of course, the pastors mention that God regretted creating people, and they immediately try to explain why that makes sense, and you're finished with worship service, you're kind of, full of the Spirit, so to speak, and you're really receptive to hearing how they're trying to make sense of this very human, very limited type of phrasing, right? This is not from an omniscient kind of being. This is just kind of a human feeling. So when they're rationalizing it, you're ready to accept it. But sitting down in your home, reading your Bible by yourself, not having a bunch of Christians around you or in the middle of worship, for example, it reads very differently. And I remember trying to read more of it, hoping it would make more sense, and it just didn't. And it seemed really weird. Noah seemed like such a bad father. He seemed like kind of a jerk, an alcoholic, just a bad guy. How was this the most perfect of God's humans? It just seemed very strange to me. And I continued to read, and a lot of it, again, continued to be very strange. So, of course, I would pray for the spirit of understanding. And that understanding never came. So, of course, you beg. You're crying. You're seeking God with all your heart, begging for this to make sense, because you know God's there and God will answer your prayers, especially if you seek God for guidance or to help you with something like this. I mean, it's God's word. Why wouldn't he help me with it, right? But that understanding never came. So I started asking other people, pastors, priests, even rabbis, for what they learned or were taught, or, with their different backgrounds, maybe knowing different languages or knowing about different history, knowing about different auxiliary texts. Maybe there's something they learned that would make sense of it. And sometimes it made some sense, and sometimes it didn't. But I think the most impactful statement came from a pastor where I was attending a service. The pastor was talking about some different thing. I don't really remember what the message was, but he brought up part of Exodus. And instead of closing my Bible after the verse was read, I continued to read and just sort of ignored the rest of the sermon. And what I found was really weird was that I read that the Spirit of God sought to kill Moses. But when Moses opened the door, his wife had circumcised their son and threw the foreskin on Moses' feet. And God changed his mind and didn't kill Moses, and he left. I thought that was really strange. And so I waited after church and asked the pastor for what, of course, this pastor must know more than I did. I never questioned that the Bible was wrong. I always thought my understanding of it was wrong. So I asked the pastor after to help me understand this, because after all, if God seeks to kill somebody, he's going to kill somebody. Moses can't write him a love poem on the fly to change God's mind. God doesn't change his mind. And the pastor said, yeah, you're right. But remember that God didn't write this down by his hand. This was written by Moses, which of course is disputed, but that's what the pastor was saying. This was written by Moses, and Moses really believed that the Spirit of God was there to kill him, so that's what Moses wrote down. Remember, these are people's interpretations of God's actions in their lives. Wow. That was really something. Around that time, Hurricane Katrina had happened. It hit New Orleans, and I remember a lot of Christians were saying things like, well, of course, this area is full of such sin. New Orleans has Mardi Gras, and people are sexual, and they are drunkards, and they are gay. And I thought, well, that's silly. We know how hurricanes happen. And hurricanes are not unusual in this region. This is an area that gets hit by hurricanes, pretty regularly. Why would we say that it was God's wrath? And I always thought it was strange, too, because if God wanted to destroy a city for being sinful, wouldn't it be Las Vegas? I mean, the nickname is Sin City. And maybe New Orleans has Mardi Gras, but there's drunkards and legal prostitution and gambling all year round in Las Vegas. So if any place to be hit by a surprise hurricane from the wrath of God, wouldn't it be Las Vegas? And that made me think, well, wait a minute, what about Sodom and Gomorrah? If we use this idea that the pastor had said, where it's people's interpretation of God's work, and there's people today that are interpreting God's work, quote unquote. What if Sodom and Gomorrah was just a natural disaster that somebody believed was God's wrath. After all, if God makes Sodom and Gomorrah an example, shouldn't God follow through and destroy every other city for being sinful? Shouldn't Las Vegas have been destroyed already, for example? So it seems to be reasonable to think perhaps out of the two choices, it was a natural disaster that the author had interpreted or misinterpreted as God's wrath. As I continued reading the Bible, again, there were just some odd things that showed up. Jesus seemed like a real jerk. And this was me as a Christian thinking this. Not some atheist who's trying to be condescending. I was a Bible-believing Christian, I guess questioning the Bible, but still a believing Christian. And here I was thinking that Jesus was a jerk. He seemed very condescending to his disciples, very rude to his brothers and his mother, wanting to pit people against each other and rip families apart. And he just seemed like kind of a jerk. I was really shocked. I was surprised at just how human Jesus seemed. That was such a weird one for me. And again, continuing to read, I liked the writing of Paul until I really started reading the writing of Paul. Again, seemed like kind of a condescending jerk. Who was Paul to tell everybody this? What if Paul's event was not spiritual? What if he had some very natural kind of event that happened? Some people say perhaps epilepsy, but anything else could have happened. The guy could have been really dehydrated and was overwhelmed, fell down, hit his head. I mean, I saw that happen in the Marines. We had somebody fall out at the end of a hump, which is these gear-laden hikes that we do, because they were dehydrated, cracked their head. What if that's what happened to Paul? And then he thought, oh, this is a sign from God. And then he writes everything down that are his idea. Why should we take Paul seriously? How do we know that Paul was speaking on behalf of God? How do we even know that? And that really, by the time that I got to the end of Revelation, I couldn't believe the Bible. There were just too many things that were either contradictory, factually wrong, or just so human. This didn't really seem like anything that I could trust as evidence of God's will for my life. Speaking of will, God's will trumps all. I didn't see anything about free will in the Bible. I remember having to talk to my friends about this idea of free will versus God knowing everything and how the two work together. But I didn't see free will in there at all. I saw God violating free will, and a few times we're told we can't question God. Who are we to question God? Just accept that God is going to take over, do what he wants, and if your life is ruined or if other people's lives are ruined, so be it. It's God's will, not yours. That really seems strange. I remember being taught to pray, Lord, it's your will, not mine, so thy will be done, if you were praying for some outcome for something. But really, it was God just going to do whatever he wants, I don't have any say in the matter. There's no will. If I don't, I could want to do X and God forces me to do Y. I don't have free will, biblically speaking. Anyway, I ended up leaving Christianity, but not the belief. I knew there was a God because I had so many personal experiences. So I thought maybe it was just the wrong religion. So of course, you look at Islam, you look into Buddhism. I even looked into shamanism and stuff. And I think once you apply that level of scrutiny to a really deeply held religious belief, it's really easy to apply that same level of scrutiny to other beliefs that you don't hold deeply. And so I couldn't really accept those religions either. So I just became spiritual, I know there's at least one God, and there's some similarities in other religions. There's multiple gods, or God has a son, and monotheism seems pretty rare. So maybe there's multiple gods or not. Maybe there's one God who presents himself differently, and any belief is okay as long as you believe, or something along those lines. And that's just what I believed. After all, again, I had these spiritual experiences. But finally, the part that left me, or had me leaving the religion, was when somebody asked me what I believe. We were just having a discussion. And I wanted to tell them that I believe in a spiritual world. I know the spiritual exists. But I thought, what if they ask me, how do I know that? So I got to take a step back and explain that I've had these supernatural experiences that point to they prove the spiritual realm. But then I thought, well, what if they don't believe in the spiritual realm? Do the experiences by themselves demonstrate a spiritual realm? And I thought about that. They didn't. I only believed that these were evidence of the spiritual because I already assumed the spiritual realm existed. But if I took that assumption away, there was nothing special about those experiences at all. I didn't leave my faith. It dissolved away at that very moment. It just dissolved. It was a very strange feeling because I never expected that. And as the words came out of my mouth for I guess I'm agnostic, they surprised me. It was almost an automatic thing, and hearing myself say that, it didn't feel wrong, but it was so unexpected. I mean, I was this really gung-ho, on fire for Jesus kind of Christian. I felt like I had witnessed and even performed exorcisms. This is not somebody that becomes agnostic or becomes an atheist. I didn't know the difference really about the two terms at the time. This is not somebody that does that. This is a person that becomes a leader in the spiritual community. This is somebody who leads other people to their faith. This isn't a person who abandons their faith. And again, I didn't feel like I chose to leave. I didn't feel like it was even the quote-unquote right choice. It just seemed like the only possible conclusion. It was a very strange time. I would say it took about 8 years from start to finish. So it was a very interesting time. I think one of the reasons that it took so long is I had spent so much time evangelizing and proselytizing. I ended up being, that Christian student that gets in front of their class and invites them to youth group, and I always remember being told that, oh, in this one church, this 15-year-old or 16-year-old, they were at school, they invited their church or their classes to church, and as soon as they did, the power of God descended on the class and everybody fell to their faces and repented, and the teachers started crying and repenting. And I was always waiting for that moment because I had so much faith and I knew this is what's going to happen. So I would get to that point when I would finish my invitation and I was like, yes, they're going to be on their face crying out to God. And nobody cared. Nobody came. Nobody fell on their face. When I would pray openly or have Bible group at school, and we'd have this, time where we could discuss how to be better Christians on campus, I was told that the school would shut us down and we would have all these terrible things happen. But if we dealt with that persecution and we just, kept having faith, that we would win the whole school over. And nobody cared. Nobody cared that I read my Bible at school. Nobody cared that I did any of that. And when I'd have my Bible at school, it was always rereading something I had read before, just in case somebody was asking me what I was reading. I'd already know what to say because I've read this passage before. So it wasn't really studying the Bible. It was more using it as like a conversation starter, and it never worked. Somebody like that, I felt, would never become an atheist. Somebody like that knows why they believe. I would even tell people that it's not even a faith anymore. It's not a belief, it's knowledge. You know, it's a relationship with Jesus. I don't believe that he's real. I know that he's real. And then I left. I felt like I had no choice. That was just the most fair and honest conclusion that I could make. That being said, if you guys want to share yours and what happened with you, then feel free. I'd love to read about it. Remember to check out the pinned comment below. But otherwise, I'll see you guys later. As always, thanks for listening.